presentation of the Public Television Network of Alaska.
This Permanent Fund 10th Anniversary Special is made possible in part through a grant from the Permanent Fund Corporation and KTOO-TV.
Good evening and welcome to a special honoring the 10th anniversary of Alaska's Permanent Fund Corporation. I'm your host, Jeanine Pohl, and in the next hour we'll look at the history of the multi-billion-dollar savings account that belongs to all Alaskans and is now celebrating its 10th birthday. We'll look at how the Permanent Fund is managed today to make money and how it has performed over the years. And after a historical overview, our guests here in the studio will take questions from viewers and listeners around the state on any and all aspects of the Permanent Fund. They're more than qualified to do that because with us are President and former members of the Permanent Fund Board of Trustees. With us tonight we have the first chairman of the board, who also served as a trustee from 1980 to 1982, Elmer Rasmuson of Anchorage. Next to him is Dr. George Rogers, also a chair in 1983 and a trustee between 1980 and 1983. And also with us before taking on a new job requiring a move from Fairbanks to Juneau late last year, Governor Steve Cowper was a Permanent Fund trustee from 1982 through 85 and also served as a chair. And a current member and chairman of the Permanent Fund Board with us is Byron Mallot, head of Sea Alaska Incorporated here in Juneau. We'll be beginning the question and answer part of our program after a short video presentation. We have a brief walking tour through the history of the Permanent Fund. Our tour guide is Dave Rose, Executive Director of the Alaska Permanent Fund Corporation.
You know, Alaska's Permanent Fund is a whole lot more than just an annual dividend check. In fact, the fund has been around for 10 years now. In fact, the Permanent Fund was in existence for 5 years before there even was a dividend program. The ball started to roll in 1969 when the state received $900 million from the Prudhoe Bay bonus sale. What to do with that $900 million was the subject of a considerable amount of discussion. The money was allocated for health and education needs, basics such as roads, schools, and airports. As both legislators and citizens realized that Alaska would begin to see an increasing flow of revenue from oil exploration and development, the talk turned to saving some of that wealth for future needs. The talk turned into legislation. In 1975, the legislature presented Governor J. Hammond with a bill to establish an Alaska Mineral Lease Bonus Permanent Fund. Hammond supported the idea of a permanent fund, but vetoed the legislation because such a fund would be considered dedicated revenue, something not allowed under the state constitution. Hammond quickly turned around and introduced his own legislation, asking Alaskans to approve a constitutional amendment creating a permanent fund. And in November of 1976, voters approved the fund by a healthy margin. That put the legislature to work the following year at figuring out how to manage the fund. House and Senate special committees held public forums around the state to listen to ideas of how the new permanent fund should be invested, managed, and parceled out. Annual deposits were made into the fund, then managed by the Department of Revenue. 1980 was a significant year in the history of the Permanent Fund. Legislation was passed creating an Alaskan Permanent Fund Corporation. The legislation also provided that 50% of oil royalties from lease sales after 1979 would be deposited into the fund. In prior years, that amount had only been 25%. The newly formed corporation was also directed to invest prudently, and we'll talk about what that means later on, and establish the point that safety of the fund's principal was most important. The Alaska legislature also kicked in special additional deposits to the fund beginning in 1980 above the amount required by law. In 1980, that amount was $900 million, and in 1981, $1.8 billion. The Permanent Fund dividend program arrived in 1982, using earnings averaged through a formula to determine the check amount. And since 1982, the Permanent Fund Corporation has had responsibility for managing investments. The Permanent Fund is a trust. It's organized in a corporation separate from state government, which is managed by 6 trustees appointed by the governor. Their responsibility is to set management, operational, and investment policy. They in turn hire an executive director who hires the staff. The small 12-person staff at the fund is responsible for all of the investment, the accounting, and the safekeeping activity, as well as research and liaison with the public. For example, our Chief Investment Officer, Bill Means, is usually in the office by about 6 a.m., finding out what national and world events are affecting prices of stocks, bonds, and real estate.
We're talking to securities dealers in New York, San Francisco, Seattle, sometimes even London, to see what is going on and to see how they see the market, what other investors are doing in the market, what are large insurance companies, for example. Are they, we find currently they happen to have a great deal of cash and are putting it to work. And that's been one of the forces that has been driving the prices of bonds up and stocks up recently, is the large pools of cash that they have at this time of the year.
The managers of the Permanent Fund take a conservative approach to investing the state's money, and that approach is required by law. The fund uses the prudent investor rule, which is a set of standards used by institutional and trust investors. It's a very conservative rule. The fund is very much like Wee Willie Keeler, an old-time baseball player who played at the turn of the century. In his 19-year career, Wee Willie Keeler only hit about 40 home runs, and he only struck out about 40 times. He hit about 2,500 singles. The fund is very much like Keeler in the sense that we don't try to hit triples and home runs. We're content with consistency, a lot of singles, maybe an occasional double. And in fact, the Permanent Fund has done better than its projected 3% rate of return in the last 5 years, topping out last year at a nearly 11% return on investment. The state of Alaska has saved nearly a quarter of its oil wealth since the Permanent Fund was created in 1977. Money that makes up the Permanent Fund comes from several sources. There's the dedicated revenue, the oil money, which is 36% of the fund. Legislative special appropriations make up over half of the fund, 53%. And inflation proofing accounts for 11% of the fund total. We try to invest the fund the same as your personal savings account. We try to protect the principal, we try to invest wisely, and we try to protect ourselves against inflation. Let me give you an example. Let's assume that this picture represents the body or the principal of the fund, and this picture represents earnings in a given year. Now, while we're spending a year trying to earn money, inflation is very silently working to erode the purchasing power of the principal of the fund. For example, if the principal of the fund is worth $1, and we have 3% inflation over the period of a year, at the end of the year, the purchasing power of the principal is only 97 cents. So what we do at the fund is first, out of earnings, add money back into the principal of the fund to make up for that loss due to inflation. We also, at the same time, put some money aside for dividends, which we turn over to the state to make available for the people. If there's anything left over after we meet these 2 first obligations, then that can be spent by the legislature any way they see fit. Since 1977, the fund has earned $3.2 billion, not including any special legislative appropriations. $834 million of that total was added to the fund's principal for inflation proofing. $914 million has been paid out to Alaskans in the form of dividend checks. $1.2 billion was appropriated to the principal, and $228 million was transferred to the general fund. The investments that comprise the fund are a mix of corporate and federal bonds, common stock, and real estate. Investment Officer Bill Means says a mix of investment options gives any corporate fund flexibility.
One of the key premises of any investment policy is diversification of assets. So we own not only debt, but we own common stock, which is the ownership of companies.
The future of the Permanent Fund in the near term is one of continued growth. One of the paradoxes of Alaska's oil wealth account is that as the state's income from oil fields has leveled off and declined, permanent fund earnings have headed in the opposite direction, up. Some say that's a good argument against any proposal to invest all of the funds in Alaska.
In fact, we've had rather counter-cyclical performance. As the economy of the state has slowed down, we have experienced tremendous increase in profits in the permanent fund because we have invested outside of the state.
What about the future of the permanent fund? Well, certainly the principal is going to continue to grow, not as fast as it has in the past, but it will continue to grow. And hopefully the fund will be well managed in the future. But what about earnings? Earnings can be used in several ways. They can be used to inflation-proof, they can be used to pay dividends, they can be used to supplement state revenues. Ultimately, the decision is up to you, the people of Alaska. It's your fund.
As Executive Director of the Permanent Fund, Dave Rose gave his managerial point of view as to the future of the fund. I'd now like to ask our guests from both your personal and historical perspective as trustees where you see the fund going in the years ahead. And Mr. Rasmuson, as first chair, I'll let you go first.
Well, I'd like to say a few words about the start of the fund. Those of us that were on it in the first trustee body had the challenge of setting some of the guidelines for what was going to be the philosophy for the future.
When you say challenge, is that an understatement maybe?
Well, I think we were breaking new ground, and we had to proceed cautiously. I think we quickly saw that there were two things mainly that we should consider. One was to get independence for the fund. Prior to that time, it was under the Department of Revenue. Secondly, we needed to enlarge the investment capabilities of the fund so as to permit it to invest in equities, common stocks, and more than just restricted government bonds.
The ability to diversify.
Well, it was not only diversify, but also get the benefit of the growth of securities, which is inherent in equities and common stocks. And we had an agreement with legislative leaders that we would take the first year to thoroughly study the problem, work together, and the second year we would introduce the legislation. Legislation was introduced, and basically it resulted in what we know there is today in the Permanent Fund. And I think that the moves that we made has given independence, it has given confidence in the management of the fund, and also it has made it very lucrative in its growth in earnings.
I know there was a little bit of public concern initially that the Permanent Fund might be too independent. I read somewhere that it was referred to, someone was concerned that it had become a fourth branch of government. Is that something you had to take into consideration when putting it all together?
I think that we handle it this way, and I believe that it's the same position that the subsequent trustees follow, namely that our duty as trustees was an investment one. And that investment included inflation proofing. But the use of the money belonged to the decision of the executive and the legislature because it was the people's money. And by sticking to our last, in other words, not getting out of what was our real investment duties, I think we avoided getting into a position where we were trying to dictate.
And where do you see it now after several years? Where is the Permanent Fund going?
Well, I think that it has done an amazing job, and I'm very complimentary to all of the trustees. Been very privileged to have sat in on various of the meetings. I think that they're doing the right thing and tending to diversification. There are improvements in investment that are discussed regularly, and I think that the fund is very adaptable to that. And I think, I want to say, the proof of the pudding is what's left on the plate, and I think they've done a good job.
pretty big plate as of right now. Dr. Rogers, you're a former trustee and chair and also an economist, and maybe with a combination of those views, what do you see ahead for the Permanent Fund?
Well, as Elmer said, the first 2 years were, in a sense, we were learning, trying to get things together. You mentioned the fear that we would be too independent. Actually, our function was very rigidly prescribed by the legislature, and then from that point on, we followed principles. As for the future, I think you want me to talk about the future, don't you, not about the past. The Permanent Fund is now in a position that it's at this point, it's very important to look at the future of the state economy in relation to the fund. When we started, we were on an upswing. The Prudhoe Bay curve was moving up. On top of that was the inflated OPEC price, which is something we should not have factored into our state spending, but we did nonetheless. And the Prudhoe Bay curve, the basic curve, is still following its normal process. It hasn't quite peaked yet. It's still, production is coming through the pipe. It's just that the revenues are less. They're closer to what they should have been during that whole period. Looking to the future, we are getting back to normal in the sense of the functioning of that part of the economy. And there are lots of other sectors to the economy we tend to forget about. So what we are in now is an adjustment of the people's expectations, an adjustment of the economy back to what we would consider a more balanced economy, one that is not dependent upon oil revenue and government.
What does that portend then for the Permanent Fund?
For the Permanent Fund, that means that the Permanent Fund should be kept as it was intended as a savings account. The Permanent Fund was intended to be a resource, a financial resource for the future, primarily. When the oil physically ran out, we would have a life after death for that the earnings from that capital would supply most of the state's revenue needs, or at least they seem to be. I think we've got to stick to that. We are in a period of some feelings of panic. I think we should set that aside. It's very important that we not do anything that would disrupt the function of the fund at this point. We'll come back to this. I won't go on. Let somebody else talk.
All right, Governor Cooper, talking about disrupting the function of the fund. Where do you see things going this year, next year, beyond in the fund? And you've got a couple of different perspectives as well.
Well, in terms of the investment policy of the fund, I think that clearly the first actions of the trustees when Elmer Rasmuson was chairman of the board was very important in that respect. It set a precedent that I believe will hold for a long time. While we may well change, for instance, the mix of investments that are allowed to the Permanent Fund, the fact of the matter is that Permanent Fund investment policy changes very, very slowly. It's a very conservative institution in that sense, not in a political sense, but in the sense that changes are made very carefully. Nobody ever rushes out and changes the investment policy of the fund without a lot of consideration, a lot of advice, a lot of debate, and that's the way it should be. It's a very smart way to run a fund which has as its basic purpose conservation of the principal, and that's what it's all about. So unlike a lot of people, I don't see a lot of change in terms of the way in which this fund is managed. I think that we had a few skirmishes in that respect when I was chairman of the board, and I went around with another well-known political figure and had some debates all over the state about the way in which trustees were investing the fund, and I think while each of us made some points there, I think that most people believed that the conservative, careful philosophy was much preferable to what was being suggested by the other team, so to speak.
Mr. Mallot, is conservative investment for the fund working, and will it continue to work in the future? What do you see down the road?
Well, I think it's important to emphasize that after 7 years of active management of the fund, we have just now got the asset allocation within the fund about to the point where we think it needs to be in order to sustain a 3% overall return over time. And I think that needs to be maintained. And the kinds of changes to the investment patterns of the fund aren't made in the light of current revenue circumstances. I think they need to be made in the light of the long-term goals of the fund, which is to preserve the principal and to grow this fund so that it is able to make a substantive impact on the revenue needs of the state when that is determined to be good public policy.
That's something that was mentioned talking about the conservative nature of how the fund is invested, get a little bit of growth, a little bit of income from your investments as time goes on. And that was something that was discussed, that trustees came up, that comes up every once in a while. The permanent fund could maybe make more money if it took a little bit more risk. We could get better profits. And I'll ask you this, and then maybe ask some people who were trustees a little bit earlier as to how that argument is dealt with. I mean,
well,
could the fund make more money?
It's clear in the statute that our principal responsibility is to maintain the corpus, that is to maintain the major principle of the fund, and so our investment priorities are fairly well established. And of course, we are a public trust fund. And I know of no public trust fund that is managed by chasing the stock market or looking at short-term returns. And while it is conservatively managed, it is required thus by statute, and good, prudent management practices obviously dictate that.
Dr. Rogers, from an economic point of view, is it...
This is very important because we're looking at the long run, long term. We're looking into the next century. And as Byron has said, we're looking at a fairly, what sounds like a very modest rate of return, but that's, of course, something that we are hoping to maintain. If you go in, yes, we could make more money, but we could lose more money. And we've got to constantly balance that. Byron alluded to the right mix. That's a mix of equities and bonded indebtedness and so on. Elmer knows all about that, but we've learned about it in the last few years. That's very important. That mix changes with the performance of these various sources of investment, and we've got to keep on top of that. But this is a case, the prudent investment rule, which is part of this, is, as Byron said, the corpus is important. Maximizing income is important, but you have to do it with adequate protection.
Is it something with the state's drop from oil revenue? Is it something to maybe look at? I'm just tossing this out as a possibility, to look at maybe taking more risks to get a little bit more profit?
No, I think this would be absolutely the worst thing to do, because that's what I warned about in my opening thing, that this is not really a time for panic. It seems to be, because there is a drop. We've dropped off a cliff here, but we're climbing up a rise that we should have expected there was going to be a drop off. So it's something we should have anticipated, and we shouldn't act as though this is the end. And we should not act in desperation trying to artificially recreate that high we had before, because that was not sustainable on sound economic basis. And so that, no, this is not a time to take additional risks.
All right. We'd like to take some calls from our viewers who've called in with their questions or comments about the Permanent Fund from around the state. Go ahead. I believe we have a call on the line now.
Hello?
Hello, go ahead, please.
My name is Ambrose Kuchak, originally from Scammon Bay. This is where I was born and raised. However, I'm traveling into the villages now and then due to the income taxes purposes. Okay, my question is that Permanent Fund is going to continue on as the year comes by, or are you going to use that Permanent Fund to somewhere else for some purposes within the state of Alaska?
I know that a lot of questions that have just been raised in the public are the possibility with the drop in oil revenues to get rid of the Permanent Fund dividend. Is that something that trustees discuss at all in their terms? We'll start with someone who's currently also in office as well as someone who was a trustee. Governor Cooper?
Well, I think that, as I understood the question, it related to whether or not the Permanent Fund itself would survive this economic downturn that we've had in the government. And of course it will. It has to by law, even if we didn't want it to, which we do. I think almost everybody in the state is committed to allowing the Permanent Fund not only to exist, but also to prosper. It's gotten to be something that is about as politically acceptable as you can get. In terms of what the income does, what you do with it, the outstanding feature of the permanent fund, in my opinion, is its flexibility. You can do all sorts of things with the permanent fund. I think that it's wrong to sit back and say, well, we know today, for now and all time, what the appropriate use of the permanent fund's income is. I wouldn't dare do that. I wouldn't tell the people who are coming along 40 years from now what they are supposed to do with the income from the permanent fund. I wouldn't do that.
But you've proposed for this year to use some of the income of the fund, not the body of the fund, which would require constitutional and use some of that income to help pay for state government this year.
That's correct. And the amount of money that we requested, at least for the way the projections go in the coming fiscal year, would not cut into either the dividends or into the inflation proofing. You don't know about inflation. You never can exactly hit it on the head. But I think that that money should be available on occasion when an economic downturn causes instability in the government.
Mr. Rasmussen, back when you were getting the Permanent Fund Corporation and set up and moving into motion, did you see a time, did you see that in 1987 a governor would have to perhaps ask to use some of the earnings of the fund to help pay for government?
Well, I think that we were very flexible and held ourselves completely open as to how that money would be used. Our charge, I think we all felt, that our duty was to maximize the earnings, but at the same time keep that fund with a great deal of care so that we preserve that capital. And as I mentioned earlier, I think we recognized that that meant not only to have a good investment, but also to maintain its buying power. Now, the rest of the utilization of the money, thank goodness, is not left up to the trustees. And it very properly is left to the executive and the legislative bodies, because it belongs to the people, and they have to make the decision through their governor and through their legislators. And I think that's the way it ought to be.
So would you say, Dr. Rogers, then, that the permanent fund, the body of the fund is permanent, but did you, when you were a trustee, look at the earnings as something that would perhaps someday down the road have to be used for...
Well, just the earnings, as Steve pointed out, when he said use the permanent fund, he did quickly say the permanent fund income. And we learned a great deal from the Canadian experience with the Heritage Foundation, which mixed these functions. You got a board of trustees that also determined social programs and other things. And it was set up very wisely by the legislature that we only had one function, that's the management of the fund. They'll determine what they're going to do with the revenues, which is appropriate. If you mix those functions, you don't do a good job of either one, in my judgment.
All right, we'd like to take another caller. Go ahead, please. Go ahead, you're on the line. Okay, we'll try and get another call there in a couple of minutes. We have the permanent fund dividend check now, and I know that when the checks first came out, especially in rural areas, they were said, the first check for $1,000 was said to really raise the income of people in rural areas, people who lived in the city with low income. Is that a good thing to have that sudden influx of money like that? Is that a good thing for the economy? I'll ask you that first, Mr. Mallot, and then go on down the line.
Well, recognizing that I'm not speaking as an investor of the fund, and in response to the specific question, I assume that it would be a good thing for the state to have that kind of income out there. And of course, the $1,000 check, if I recall correctly, was the result of several years of retained earnings of the fund being distributed.
It was an unusually high check for the first year.
At one time, yeah.
Is that something, that sudden influx, Governor Cooper, was that a good thing in terms of the economy, that sudden amount? Did that money, do you think, go right back into the Alaska's economy?
Well, if you were the one getting the check, it was a good thing. I thought that it was an appropriate thing to do at that time. The state clearly had sufficient revenue to take care of its needs. People were finding that they didn't have to say no very much on the halls of the legislature or elsewhere. And it was a pretty good thing to do with the money. It sort of opened up the rural economy in many ways. It aided and assisted a lot of people who needed that kind of influx of cash, and I think it was a good thing.
Is it something that the trustees would look at all or discuss, or have trustees discussed whether or not, if things get bad in terms of less state revenue, is the dividend something to look at not funding if you need to protect the body of the fund or to get earnings back into the fund?
It's not an issue that trustees would address as we look at our investment responsibility, because, you know, if we discuss inflation proofing, for example, as an investment function and the responsibility of the trustees, the dividend itself is a function of the disposition of the earnings of the fund and is properly a policy function of the legislature and the other branch of government.
So you would wait then to take your instructions from what the legislature or the people of Alaska through the legislature would decide?
That's right.
Right.
Actually, we don't take any instructions on that. As soon as the income is produced, it's turned over to somebody else. So that's.
I think, speaking as a former trustee, I know that we were very careful to watch any retreat from a commitment to inflation proofing, for instance, because we thought that was appropriate to maintain the purchasing value of the fund. Beyond that, we didn't figure it was any of our business. Of course, it's mine now, but I'm in a different position.
All right, we'd like to take a caller. We've got one on the line. Go ahead, please. Go ahead with your question.
Yeah. My question is, the state is in trouble with the money, and so are the people. A lot of them can't pay their house payments, and the Permanent Fund is the people's, I think. So, how come they can't make a payoff to the people of so much bucks that they can pay their bills with, and then put the dividend into state revenue instead of putting a state tax or sales tax or any of that on?
That's something that I don't know how much was discussed initially, but how permanent was the Permanent Fund? How permanent is the Permanent Fund, maybe, Mr. Rasmussen?
Well, the word permanent means forever, just like diamonds, doesn't it?
Well, is a savings, if you have a personal savings account, is that something that's forever? In tough times, you may have to dip into your savings account a little bit?
Well,
did the fund trustees kind of think about that at all initially?
I think each one of us are trying to say that the Permanent Fund is best administered and managed if you leave up to the trustees the job of best maintaining the principal and earning the money, and leave up to the people of Alaska who have a lot of different opinions as to how they want that money spent, and leave that up to the people that have that responsibility, which I say is the governor and the legislature.
So the trustees are then insulated a little bit. Public opinion will come to them through the legislature or the governor.
Well, I think a good example of mixing your responsibilities is the situation with the Heritage Fund of Alberta. There they gave them an impossible task because they charged them not only with managing the fund, but also with social responsibilities, with development responsibilities, with responsibilities that had to do with the care of their people. And I think in great wisdom, our legislature and our governor at that time, when they formulated the principles, that they didn't mix it up.
There was some discussion initially of making a permanent fund a social investment, a development bank or social investments.
As a matter of fact, what
more
happened is that the
funding.
legislature did set up those programs at the same time they set up the Permanent Fund. They set up programs for new developments. They set up programs for subsidizing housing to individuals. A whole smorgasbord of programs were set up, fishermen loans, and so on. These were all intended to take care of those things that the Heritage Foundation was also responsible. So that wisely, they said these are specialized functions. So that was split off.
And they were funded from the general fund.
That's right,
revenues of the
yes, and
state.
from the oil revenues too, and the same thing. This was just part of one end of the spectrum.
All right, we've got several callers waiting on the line. Go ahead, please.
Hello?
Hi, go ahead with your question.
Yeah, my name is Kevin Jenkins. I'm from Anchorage. My question about the Permanent Fund concerns the proposed state income tax and whether we should spend the Permanent Fund first. I find it ludicrous that during an economically depressed time, when all segments of the private economy are struggling to survive, government leaders would suggest a state income tax when the state has billions of dollars in savings. When the Permanent Fund was established, we were told that it was for the people of the state of Alaska and their children. Yet we've seen thousands of foreclosures in the paper and unemployment at an all-time high. Many businesses have had to close while others have reduced staff and payrolls to keep going. In short, most of us are seeing our opportunities severely limited. My question is, if now is not the time for the Permanent Fund to help the people of the state, then when, and if it's not going to be spent, then who are the true beneficiaries of the fund?
Is that something that comes up in discussion? You know, we've mentioned what the trustees do in terms of managing the fund, and basically, you know, we should remind viewers that it is the legislature that decides whether or not to move into the fund or how to deal with or not deal with the dividend program. But just as trustees, I would think that you couldn't help but have it sneak into your head the thought of, well, how much longer will there be a permanent fund? Do we think about an income tax as opposed to spending some of the fund? Does that come up at all in discussion, Mr. Mallot?
Well, it does come up, certainly. You know, we exist within the reality of the state, but I think that what that does is it reinforces the investment decision-making responsibility that we have, and the Permanent Fund does generate significant earnings that can and as a matter of fact does have a significant positive impact on the overall economy of our state right now.
How does that work? How does it work that the earnings
both
impact
by the
state
investments of the fund in certain sectors of the Alaskan economy, and of course through the Alaska Dividend Program. You know, there's several hundreds of millions of dollars in earnings of the fund placed directly into the Alaskan economy each year on a per capita basis, which is unique, and it is, and it has to be considered a major economic consequence of the operations of the fund. But that's a function of the public policy decisions that are made for the utilization of the earnings. And while we as citizens and even as individual recipients of the actual dividend check ourselves can't help but think about that, as trustees of the fund, our responsibilities are carefully circumscribed as having to do with the investment of the capital of the fund, and I, you know, and we've said it any number of times here, and it's difficult to stress, and it sometimes sounds as if we're really trying to avoid the reality of the circumstance of the state, but there are many others, as Mr. Rasmuson has emphasized several times, the legislature, Governor Cowper.
Maybe we should remind viewers that if they have specific points that they'd like to bring on how to use the fund, they should let their legislators know, let Governor Cowper know?
Well, I think what Kevin Jenkins, the caller, asked was, what in the world are we doing going out asking for taxes when all of this money is going out in dividends? It's a legitimate question.
And as someone who was asked about an income tax, do you have an answer?
Well, it also, I think that kind of question is going to have to be hashed out over the next few years, because believe me, even with a tax, it's going to be extraordinarily difficult to hold on to any decent level of government services over time without some utilization of the Permanent Fund income, not the principal, the income. And it goes back to what I said before, which was that flexibility is the best thing we've got going in terms of the fund. We can use that money any way that the public wants to use it. Back in 1982, we decided that the best thing to do is to pay it out in dividends. There will probably come a time when we don't think that that's the best thing to do with the money.
But it'll be the public that decides through letting the legislature know, through the executive branch, through the formal process.
Well, I think the public's going to have to vote on it in an initiative. If the dividend goes away or it's eroded in any way, I think that that the public's going to have to be heard from.
All right, we'd like to take a couple of more calls. Go ahead, please. Another caller on the line. Go ahead with your question. We got a caller on the line. Hello. Okay, we'll continue on from there. Oh, we've got someone else on. Go ahead, please.
Is this me?
Yes, go ahead.
Yes, my name is Darrell Peterson. I'm from Anchorage, Alaska. And I'll direct my question at Mr. Cooper because the people have been talking that it will be a legislative concern and an administrative concern. There's a legal requirement that requires a custodial account for minors. And my question is, why not let minor children's dividends ride until they're 18? Because the dividends their investment return has been so much better than I can get any other place or my children's accounts. And it's such a good thing, why can't adults let their dividends ride as well along with this large amount of money we have there? Thank you.
Well, I think it's a pretty good idea. You'd have to ask the permanent fund management people whether they want to manage other people's money. I don't know if they do or not, or how difficult it would be, but I certainly don't see anything wrong with the idea of allowing people to just leave their dividends in the pot, so to speak, and let them turn over and over and over, and then when the children become of age, it's a good idea.
All right, we'd like to take another caller. If we've got one on the line, go ahead, please. Go ahead. Okay, we've got another caller on the line. Go ahead.
Yeah, why don't we do it the American way? Why don't we just, for every dollar the state uses, we put one in the dividend hopper for the people? I mean, that way you get to spend the money on the bureaucracy, and we get some money to spend and stimulate the economy.
Does that mean using some of the permanent fund earnings every year?
Probably for the next, let's say while the oil's running up, for the next 5 years. I mean, that way the people would get some money, and the bureaucrats would get some money to run the government. And everybody would win.
Is that something that was
I think that
considered
that was the original
around?
philosophy of the dividend, was that, look, all this oil money shouldn't be in the hands of the bureaucrats to decide how to spend it. Let's put some of it in the hands of the people. This is not the Permanent Fund Board of Trustees. This is the legislature speaking.
Right.
And that's exactly what they did. So that's this is the caller was not actually asking a question. He was really restating the philosophy of the dividend program. He said, okay, here's something for you to expend whatever way you'd like.
There was a lot of talk when the fund was being formed and money was coming in through oil revenue deposits before there was a dividend program, of use of the fund for economic development. We've talked about some of the social kinds of purposes. Is that something that current trustees still think about, Mr. Mallot? Economic development, you mentioned an economic advantage through the dividend check, and there are some investment in Alaska bonds, but do the trustees still think about other ways to use the fund for economic development in state?
We have established several programs to invest portions of the fund within the state if those kinds of investment meet the overall investment criteria of the fund. And so in that regard, we do think, are there ways that the fund within the investment policies can be utilized within the boundaries of the state? But in terms of utilizing the fund as a primer of the pump, for example, for specific or even general economic development goals. Once again, we believe that that is a function of the utilization of the earnings, and that, to get back where we started, is a function of the legislature and the state administration. We are responsible for the investment management of the fund, and those are entirely different principles and responsibilities from economic development.
Currently, the Permanent Fund is only allowed to invest in companies which are incorporated in the United States. What was the reasoning behind that originally, and is there a reason to maybe change that now?
Yes, I'm glad somebody asked that question. When we were introducing legislation to broaden the investment powers of the Permanent Fund, it was a recommendation of our board, I think that unanimous, wasn't it, right, George, that we be allowed to include the equity investments and bonds of international character, foreign ones. And the argument runs something like this. 10 years ago, about 75% of the listed securities of the world were in the United States. At the present time, it is scarcely 50%, and it is decreasing all the time. So the first argument for international investments is that we don't want to be shut out of investment in half the world if we're going to run this fund right. I could go on a little more philosophically on that. But from a practical standpoint, the returns on the international investments during the time that has existed since the fund started have been actually higher in the international arena. And
what would it take then for the Permanent Fund to
change?
Toss a couple of $100 million over into
Well, it would
some
take a change in legislation. Right. I tried to be as persuasive as I could to those who were responsible for the committees and the legislature to include international securities. They were afraid that I think that it might be too speculative, or that it was money used outside of the United States. I don't know. I continually urge the trustees to bring up that point again for consideration by the legislature to broaden this scope of their investment powers, to not only get a higher return, but more and more business is becoming international.
Is that something that the trustees are now looking at, Mr. Mallot?
Yes.
Being able to invest abroad?
As a matter of fact, the trustees have prepared and have advanced to the administration a draft piece of legislation which would allow the trustees or the fund to invest in international markets.
And are you going to support that, Governor?
Yes,
Cooper?
I will. We'll put that bill in and support it actively.
And I think that the climate right now is more favorable. There was a fear 10 years ago of anything foreign. Now we're sort of looking, as Governor Cooper's whole philosophy is one of looking at the Pacific Rim as an investment area which will benefit Alaska. We have to be part of that community. We are, whether we know it or not, but we have to act as responsible members of that community. So I think the atmosphere has changed.
All right, we'd like to take a couple more calls before the program ends. Go ahead, please. We have a caller on the line.
Yes, hello. I'm Terry McLean from Mentasta, Alaska. And from what was stated earlier in the program, they say the Permanent Fund has been invested outside of Alaska, and that's why it's had good growth. I wonder, could there not be a percentage of that maybe allocated between business, private enterprise, and government that could be invested in Alaska to help some of the major businesses that are having trouble now? We have banks in trouble. We have hatcheries that are closing that are going to affect the fishing industry. It's so statewide that it would seem that some of that funding would reap multiple benefits if it could be allocated in some proportions with a fair return on the investment to companies and businesses and government in the state itself.
This discussion, I understand from reading just the history of the fund, it was a point that was brought up many times in the creation of the fund. what was the reason for not doing that initially? And then we'll maybe find out why.
Again, it gets back to diversification. If we had done it at the beginning, the permanent fund would be near bankruptcy right now. I think that's, I may be exaggerating a little bit, but not much, am I, Elmer?
Well, I think that you've got to be philosophic, too, about it. I took the position that all the oil revenue was part of our permanent fund, even though only part of it was set aside, say 25% of the royalty, in the so-called permanent fund. So the legislature decided to use part of that oil money for appropriations for not only capital investments, like roads and hospitals and roads and so forth, but also for many loan programs. Unfortunately, from the standpoint of the Treasury, those loan programs have not worked out very well. But the concern that we had, and this is true with the experience of other nations and other states. You know, Alaska is not the only state that has a permanent fund. There are a lot of states that they may not call a permanent fund, but they have investment funds, and they're managed very well. And so our concern was that it would be carefully managed, it would not be lost, but that we certainly did not believe that there should be a discrimination against an in-state investment. As a matter of fact, when George and I were on the trustees, we set aside a certain block of money for the purchase of the kind of housing that was not at that time eligible for the Alaska Housing Development Corporation. And it was useful. It was for types of houses that didn't qualify, and it's turned out very well. It's had good earnings.
I understand some of the argument at the time against spending a lot of money from permanent fund earnings in investing in Alaska is that some investments in Alaska haven't done so well, that if you were a private investor, you wouldn't necessarily invest in some Alaskan businesses, especially now as economic times have not been strong.
I'm not sure I understand your point, because I don't want anyone to think that I am pessimistic on Alaska. I'm very bullish on it. No, that's not the argument. The point is that you do not invest a fund by a geographical basis. You invest it according to a potential return basis. And the opportunities for investment in Alaska were solved by ADA, by ARC, by the by CFAB. I can't remember all of the number of. We were making investments in Alaska, and now that we need the money, particularly, it's a good thing that we did give this geographical distribution according to the best return and safe, and now we have it.
All right, fair enough. We'd like to take another caller. We've got one on the line. Go ahead, please.
Hi. Hello?
Hi, go ahead.
Yes, my name's Gary Costin, and I'm from Anchorage. You got a call asking to use the permanent fund and not the income tax. I just wanted to, I'm not for the income tax or the use of the permanent fund, but since we have to do one or the other, I believe that I would prefer getting a permanent fund check and paying part of that as income tax, and then taking the other part of it and using it to support my community, such as putting it into a bank or, into a savings account or whatever I want to put it into.
All right, thank you. We'll pass that along, and hopefully some legislators are watching. You can take that in for your own information. Governor Cooper, go ahead. We have another caller on the line, please. Hi, go ahead with your question. We have a caller from Bethel, I believe.
Yes.
Hi, go ahead.
Hi. We out here feel that the best use of the permanent fund monies, since it wasn't set up to guard our educational program with the monies that was put into the permanent fund in the first place, we feel that it would be a very constructive move at this time to take a portion, perhaps 50% of the monies that is paid out every year to individuals, and put that into a fund that could support our educational program. We are already seeing serious cutbacks in a program that was already bare bones before. And I don't understand why the people that control our state program don't see education as one of the most important things we're doing.
That's a good point. Already legislation has been introduced which would take earnings of the permanent fund, set money aside for school spending, perhaps take part of, another bill would take part of mineral revenues and set aside a university foundation, a different kind of a fund, maybe perhaps managed by the permanent fund. How do the trustees look at those proposals as they come in, or how would you deal with them?
Well, we would not deal with them. Once again, that would be the responsibility of the legislature, Governor Cowper. But, you know, I think that the important point from an investment point of view is that there exists that kind of flexibility at the state level, that we have the whole range of public policy options that the earnings of the fund can help to address. And I think Governor Cowper made that point early, that that was one of the great strengths of the permanent fund. And as we look at difficult revenue times, not panic, not catastrophic revenue times over the next several years, that the wisdom of having the permanent fund and the ability to flexibly use those earnings as determined by public policy, I think is going to prove more and more both the existing and the long-term value and importance of the permanent fund to the people of the state.
We have just a couple of seconds left. I'll start off with you, Mr. Mallot, if you have any closing thoughts that the people should think about their savings account, the permanent fund.
In many ways, I think that I've just made my closing statement.
That would make, all right, fair enough.
But the question of scale, I think, is important, that we have to maintain a permanent fund that is of sufficient size over time to help meet some of the real needs of the people of our state, and that requires some relatively substantial earnings, and you do that by maintaining a relatively large fund.
All right, Governor Cowper, would you have anything to add to that?
Well, I thought I'd make a pitch here while I had a couple of seconds.
Well, just a few short seconds, I should probably.
Well, I think that we do have some so-called pots of money out there, some disputed taxes and royalty payments that go up into the billions of dollars. And to me, once the state recovers that money, it ought to go to the permanent fund, as well as some of the types of endowments that the caller mentioned previously. The money ought to be invested and not spent.
All right, thank you. Dr. Rogers, briefly.
I think the other thing is that we should look at the permanent fund as a natural resource almost that is being drawn upon. Right now, the dedicated revenues from the oil industry are smaller than the earned income from the investment. And that's exactly the way, and the longer the permanent fund is left intact, the more the earnings will grow, even with the declining oil revenues. And this is precisely the function of the permanent fund.
That's a very good point. Mr. Rasmussen, since you're on the end, you get about 15 seconds to conclude with your thoughts on the fund. I'm sorry.
It's obvious from the callers that they see an identity between the permanent fund trustees and the decisions that we've been trying to claim are the legislature. Now, we're all individuals. I've got some very definite views in my own mind as to what ought to be done with the money, but not as a trustee.
Well, maybe you can lobby the governor here after we close it and pass those along. We should probably, and much of what we have heard is probably things that people should be passing along to their legislators, to the governor, and discussing among themselves.
How to use the permanent fund
How to
income.
use the fund. And thank you all for adding your insight and your historical perspectives to the history of the permanent fund. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for those of you who called in or tried to call in tonight. We appreciate it. For KTOO TV in Juneau, I'm Jeanine Pohl. Good evening.
This Permanent Fund 10th Anniversary Special is made possible in part through a grant from the Permanent Fund Corporation and KTOO TV.
A presentation of the Public Television Network of Alaska.